Violence as a response to our collective struggles has often been viewed as the last refuge of those who fail to navigate the complexities of the world. It is the desperate cry of those who, unable to reach resolution through dialogue or understanding, resort to the language of force. And yet, despite its glaring hollowness, violence continues to pervade the lives of countless individuals, communities, and nations. The notion that violence is the ultimate solution, the final recourse in the face of crisis, speaks to the growing incompetence within our societies, a failure to embrace our shared humanity and resolve differences through peaceful means. In a world that is increasingly divided, the temptation to respond to violence with more violence is overwhelming. It's a knee-jerk reaction, almost instinctual, as if our primal urge for self-preservation has been ignited and cannot be extinguished. But here lies the great tragedy. Violence can never create the lasting change we yearn for. It is a dead-end road, a vicious cycle that spirals endlessly, consuming all in its path. In the wake of violence, only bitterness remains in the hearts of the survivors, and brutality is etched deep into the souls of those who unleash it. The suffering it causes can never be measured in terms of victory or defeat, for violence leaves behind nothing but scars that never fully heal. How often do we hear of the horrific consequences of violence, whether it's in the form of war, domestic abuse, racial oppression, or even the everyday cruelty that permeates our communities? These wounds are not merely physical, they are spiritual, emotional, and psychological. They are the invisible chains that bind us to a past we cannot escape. And yet, despite the lessons that history should have taught us, we find ourselves repeating these same mistakes again and again, as if we have learned nothing from our collective suffering. In the face of this ongoing cycle, the only true answer to violence is not retaliation or counter-violence, but love. It is love, in its most transformative form, that holds the power to break the cycle. Love is not passive. It is a radical act, a courageous refusal to succumb to hatred, fear, or vengeance. Love, as a force for change, has the capacity to heal wounds that violence only deepens. It builds bridges where walls have been erected and opens doors where there has been nothing but closed, locked spaces. Love, when practiced unconditionally, has the power to turn enemies into allies, strangers into neighbors, and fear into understanding. This idea of love as a weapon against violence is not a naive or idealistic fantasy. It is rooted in the experiences of those who have walked the path of nonviolence. From Mahatma Gandhi to Martin Luther King Jr., these were not men who were weak in the face of violence, but rather, they were among the strongest of us all. Those who saw beyond the immediate confrontation and understood that true strength lies in the power to endure, to forgive, and to rebuild. The best sabotage against the forces of oppression and destruction, they understood, was love. For love cannot be vanquished by hatred. It endures, it thrives, it multiplies. Imagine a future where our children, born into a world untainted by the horrors of war, can ask a question like, what was war? Not out of ignorance, but out of a deep understanding that such a thing no longer exists. What would that world look like? A world where compassion is the driving force behind global policy, where empathy leads to cooperation rather than conflict, where nations no longer build weapons, but build schools, hospitals, and sustainable futures for all. This is not a dream that exists in the abstract, but a possibility that is within our reach if we choose to stop perpetuating this cycle of violence. The world is addicted to violence, and like any addiction, it is a force that numbs us to the true possibilities of change. It convinces us that power can only be wielded through dominance, that justice can only be achieved through retribution. But these are lies. They are the stories told by those who cannot imagine a different way of being in the world. In reality, the weapon of the weak is violence. It is the ultimate admission of failure, the last-ditch attempt to assert control when other, more compassionate avenues have been exhausted or ignored. The weapon of the strong, however, is nonviolence, the ability to see beyond immediate self-interest, to resist the urge for instant gratification through force, and to stand firm in the conviction that peace is not just a possibility, but a moral imperative. To be nonviolent is not to be passive. It is to actively create space for dialogue, for understanding, for the recognition of each person's intrinsic worth. It is a strength that refuses to yield to fear or hatred, and instead seeks out the common humanity that binds us all. Nonviolence is the strength of vision, of imagination, of a belief that a better world is possible. It is the capacity to look at the suffering in the world and say, this can end. This must end. The future must be a future in which violence becomes a relic of the past, a distant memory of a time when humanity was still lost in its illusions of power. It must be a future where love, in all its manifestations, is our greatest strength. For in love, we will find the courage to confront the forces that divide us, the resilience to withstand the darkness, and the wisdom to create a world where peace is not just a dream, but a reality.